This is Unpacking K-5 Math for Caregivers, and today we are going to talk about what does it mean to approach math from a perspective of strength, and Jessica will get us started.
Yeah. So I thought we could talk about, can you guys see that?
Yep.
I thought we could talk about just starting from this word. I just want to kind of throw it out there, like, what do we think when we see this word, and how it might affect how we might interact with kids in terms of noticing and building from their strengths. I don't know if anybody had any thoughts.
Well, for me, when I hear remediation, I already think we are started for something that is not good. You know, I'm fixing.
Yeah.
That's where I go.
And that's, I was going to say the same thing when I hear, yeah, it sounds like we're trying to fix something versus exactly what you just said, Paola, rather than starting from what a kid knows. It may be that we're trying to start from what they don't know or what they can't do. That's what the word makes me think of.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
for
yeah,
the premise that maybe there's something wrong with them that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree. Like for me, like when I see that word, I think about starting from what's wrong, and bringing someone's thinking into line with what's correct, or maybe even conventions. And some people may say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, for me, like an issue, and I feel like I heard it from what you guys were saying in terms of what the word brings up for you, is that if we think about kids' dispositions as mathematical thinkers and doers, for instance, it may become really altered when their ideas are not taken up and used in a productive way. So here's kind of where I thought, where my thinking went when I was thinking about building from kids' strengths. So if you check out, for instance, this student's thinking, so this is a real exchange. I was talking to a student about sharing 5 tacos among 2 people equally, and here's kind of the exchange that we had. The student drew 5 groups of 2 and said it was 10, and I said, well, how do you know that? And they said, well, I saw 5 and 2, so I drew 5 equal groups. And so I said, okay, so how does that relate to this problem that we're working on? And he kind of looked at me for a bit, and I said, what would you do if you had to share those tacos? Could you picture them in front of you on a plate? And at that point, he kind of redrew his picture. I think he actually got some linking cubes that were nearby and said, one for me, one for you, one for me, one for you. Then he kind of pushes the leftover one to the side and said, well, this would, you get 2, and and you maybe you get 3. And I said, oh, well, what would happen if we each wanted the same? And he said, well, there's not enough. So I started thinking about, what, I guess in my head, I started trying to compare and contrast, what might be one response if we worked from that whole stance of remediation to this student's thinking.
So I think if we are remediating, we would probably help the student focus on the 5 tacos, the 2 people, and then help the student understand that I can actually share the last taco and think about how you could do that.
And also along with that, I think that in the line of remediation, it might be that the student gets stopped as soon as they start drawing more than 5 tacos. Yeah. And that they get stopped right in the middle of it. Oh, stop, what are you doing? Rather than giving the kid the opportunity to work through their own thinking.
Yeah. So you wouldn't even get through this dialogue as you constructed it, Jessica.
No.
Right.
No, yeah, that's a really good point. Chances are you wouldn't. In fact, I mean, you might say something like this. we might stop as soon as he started drawing out his groups of two and say, well, that's not quite right, or, I would have, or, let me help you. The first thing we should think about is da 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 da, say, how many people are sharing, say it with me. And for me, that probably the biggest concern that comes up for me in something like that is that their response could lead to some pretty strong deficit beliefs based on the part of the student. We know the beliefs they're really strong things that over time they become really hard to change. Sort of like, I don't know if you've ever heard like the rope and the elephant story. Have you guys ever heard of that?
I don't know that.
Well, someone said this to me once when I was a doc student. I never forgot it.
No,
So kind of, I guess the story goes something like, a woman was passing by this elephant and she stopped kind of suddenly, and she was really confused by the fact that this huge creature was being held only by this very small, thin rope tied to their front leg, no chains, no cages. And it was obvious that the elephant could at any time, break away and become free, but for some reason he didn't. So she saw a trainer nearby and she said, why is that elephant just standing there? Why aren't they making any attempts to get away? And the trainer said, well, when elephants are really young and much smaller, we use this exact same size rope to tie them. But at that age, the rope is really strong. It's strong enough to hold them. By the time they're grown, their minds have become conditioned to believe that no matter how much they try, they'll never break it. So they still believe that rope can hold them. So they never try to break themselves free. So I always bring up that story when I think about, building from kids' strengths or not, because I think like that rope, that kids will often form beliefs very early in their lives that'll hold them back from seeing themselves as thinkers and doers. So for instance, not getting a particular answer or using a particular method, or having their thinking kind of shut off, as we talked about might happen in the previous example. So this whole idea that, math doesn't come from me, it comes from somebody else, and that my ideas are wrong and don't make any sense. And those beliefs become really, really hard to break. So I think that for me is what's troubling a little bit about remediation. So what about this word? What do you guys think of when you see this word?
I think about making it work. How do I
it
adapt
still feels.
to make it work? Sorry.
I know. It still feels like it's about you're having to adapt adapt what I do in order to make it fit something else.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, that definitely could be. I guess I take the word a little bit differently. I kind of take it toward kind of the opposite of remediating. I kind of take it toward kids have valid ways of thinking that from their frame of reference makes a lot of sense. So to build up an understanding of anything, we kind of have to start from that. They have to start from what makes sense to them. So if kids have a valid way of thinking and knowing, then if we can accept that, then we also have to accept that even if kids think about things in ways that we don't expect, like building up groups of two and that problem, that thinking is not wrong. It's not deficient. It's theirs. It's full of strengths and that any human uses, arguably, as they work to make sense. So we start to change our focus, I think, from do they know it to how are they thinking about it. I guess for me, that's what that word means, to kind of see kids from that lens.
So Jessica, before you go, do you think that is something that caregivers can do as well in informal situations? How do you see caregivers engaging with kids in that way?
Well, I think it works from really, it starts really simply, like kind of as you like see on the screen. It just from a lens of noticing, how they thought about it, and just bringing that forward. I noticed that made groups of two. How are you thinking about that? Conveying that like you have good ideas. For instance, obviously, I would say that child in the tacos problem, like they knew about equality, because in one of their solutions, they dealt out tacos 1-to-1. They also initially built out groups of two, so they had ideas about using two that they could use to think with. And they also initially if you notice, they moved that final taco to the side because they noticed that they didn't have enough to make equal shares in terms of whole tacos. So they have a way of thinking about it that to them makes sense, and that we as teachers, caregivers can notice and bring forward and talk with kids about.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking as you were talking, I was thinking that as a math educator, I have this curiosity about kids' math all the time. So I see something that is unexpected. And for me, what that brings is this curiosity, right? Oh, how'd you get there? What were you thinking? Or things like that. And I'm wondering if that is something that caregivers can try to develop, which is just this curiosity about where the child is coming from or thinking before you go ahead and fix them, right? Remediate them. Could we attend then to understanding where they're coming from? I don't know that that's how caregivers think, but it could be something that you can learn to approach things that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking about in the context right now where a lot of caregivers are working with their children at home, instead of immediately. So if a child comes to you with a question about maybe something that they're working on for math for their teacher, then first to ask them, what do you understand about this problem? Tell me what's happening, right? Before immediately, like what you're saying, Paola, before immediately telling them exactly what to do. So really valuing the way that they're thinking about it, because it's natural, right? I think it's natural in general as a human and as a caregiver to immediately want to just help versus maybe hearing their thinking first, which is what you're saying, right? They're being heard, which I see that on your screen, Jessica.
Yeah, and I think, for me, what the change there with our own, just kind of being curious and noticing how they're thinking, is it actually kind of changes how they see themselves in the math as well. So instead of seeing, I'm wrong, I didn't get the right answer, that they start seeing, maybe I have some good ideas about this problem. Maybe my ideas are valuable. They're valid. There are things that I can think about and do in mathematics. And I really think that becomes generative for kids over time. So instead of, the elephant, if you will, always being held by the rope, that, I'm not a math person, that they learn, that rope never even comes into existence for them. If we can kind of change our focus, it kind of changes kids' realities.
Yeah. I like that. It does change reality, for sure. I like that. I have two kids and they were very different in everything. But in math, I had one. So I'm going to talk about my N of two. But I have my one who always could get it and one who struggled. But I remember always saying, okay, in this house, you're not allowed to say you don't love math. They know they couldn't say that. And we had to find a way to make it interesting. And even my child who struggled, to this day, I will say the one child is curious and likes it, which I know this is an exaggerated example, but I do think that did change reality for my kid who struggled. That It's like, no, you can't just say I don't like math. So let's talk about it. Let's think about it. What is interesting? How are you? And it was always just thinking outside the box, which I thought was a great thing, you know, and then I learned to understand how that was outside the box to be able to help my child. I'm trying not to reveal their gender because I have one son and a daughter, so. Yeah, I like it. And I think trying to also focus on what can you do? Where are you starting? How are you thinking about this already? I think that's also good. Which parts you got right, you know, or which parts I'm like, oh, I can see you understand this part and you're doing this really well. So let's think about the other parts.
Well, and I think this, as far as like caregivers, you know, reminder to caregivers is that there typically is multiple ways to approach math problems. Even though we might think that there's only one way, there are usually always multiple ways. And that relates to this, right? By really listening to kids and understanding that there's lots of ways to do problems and really listening to their thinking rather than trying to impose our own thinking as adults.
So something that may sound initially wrong actually could be mathematically right, just different from where the caregiver thought, you know, how the caregiver would answer the problem.
Right. Yeah, because the caregiver might think, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3, the way that they had learned it, but in fact, there might be another way to do it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, you know, what we're talking about is definitely a change of mind, if you will, because, you know, I think a lot of us, you know, especially if that's the way we learn math ourselves, are going to approach things that way. So I think, you know, changing that focus around or kind of, you know, turning that around a bit is definitely challenging because it's counter to what we knew math to be as well. So it's definitely, you know, it's definitely something that's not intuitive to us, but potentially really powerful for kids.
Yeah. So if we wanted to conclude with maybe an advice for caregivers, what would you say? I think I would say just be curious about where the child is going mathematically, listen, and find the strength and go from there.
I would agree, and I would really build off of the listening piece. I mean, part of seeing kids' strengths, and a big part of it is that listening piece. And I just listen and you know, hear what the thinking is, and be curious about where it could go.
I agree with what you both said. I think the biggest thing in terms of a tip for a caregiver who's working with their children or having conversations is to listen. Exactly what you just said, Jessica. Let them have a chance to share their thinking before you impose your own ideas.